All right, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk about some basic tax concepts for APO chapters as a 501c3. Okay, so I always like to start my presentations with a little breakdown of how the presentation is going to go. I'm going to start with some background about me and then talk about what a 501c3 is, go over sales and use taxes and exemption certificates, federal income tax deductions, and what to do with your donors, and then some tax reporting regarding 990s and local tax reporting for the states in our region. So some background about me. I have an accounting degree. I'm from Pittsburgh originally and then moved to Columbus after I graduated. My professional background is in all sorts of areas in public accounting, but currently I work in indirect tax, which is sales and use tax, business licensing, miscellaneous other state and local taxes. And I work with everything from, Joe's restaurant to companies in the top 20 of the Fortune list. So all industries, all different kinds of companies, nonprofits, publicly traded corporations, everything. So I know a lot of different things. I know a little bit about a lot of different things. But the reason I put this together is tax issues can be really frustrating for nonprofits, especially our chapters, with how turnover is with students. Students hopefully won't be there more than a few years, right? If they graduate. So I'm going to start with what a 501c3 is. 501c3 is a specific section in the IRS code. So 501c is where all the nonprofits are defined. There's about 29 different kinds of nonprofits. So number 3 is charitable organizations, includes churches, educational institutions, and APO chapters. The kind of distinguishing thing about charitable organizations, the 501c3 designation, is there's a lot of restrictions on political lobbying and fundraising. So there's other kinds of nonprofits that aren't considered charitable, but they're considered a not-for-profit. So a 501c4, a 5/6, something like a chamber of commerce, a labor union, political action committees. There's not a profitable purpose for that organization, but they aren't charitable, right? They're doing lobbying. They're allowed to get involved in politics. 501c3s aren't. So that's where our political thing comes from. We're not allowed to do anything that way. Yeah. So that's.
I don't think it's just that. I think it's also
right. I got it.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize there was like a legit reason why we were here.
Yeah, and there is a fine line between, doing social justice initiatives and political lobbying, right? So if you meet with, local congressmen to talk about what's going on in your area, that's acceptable. But if you meet with somebody who's a candidate in a current race and show support for that candidate, do something that favors them, that's a problem, right? So that's something to be mindful of. And there are certain things nonprofits that are 501c3s can do regarding political issues, but you can't show a political affiliation when it comes to legislation and elections. Donations to 501c3s, because of their charitable purchase, are considered tax exempt for donors, both for personal income tax and business income tax. So I'll talk about donation acknowledgement letters in a little bit, but that's kind of where the benefit is, right? Because if you donate to a political action committee, a 501c3, 5 or a 4, 5 or 6, something like that, you're not able to deduct that from your income taxes. So that's why we always say we're a 501c3 when we're trying to get donations, because you can get those tax benefits if you donate. And this slide is the straight from the IRS website, some requirements to be exempt from income tax under a 501c3. So I kind of already talked about it, but I put that in there as, here's what the actual IRS is saying about this. APO is a 501c3 because we meet the charitable purpose. There's no financial benefit to one private shareholder, and we're not an action organization. So we don't do any political lobbying. And like Sabrina said, this is why we have to be careful showing any political affiliations. So our national office or region sections and all chapters in the US should be organized as a 501c3 organization. Something like a trust fund is a different kind of organization, and I'm not going to talk about that. And then when it comes to state issues, I'm going to talk about the federal stuff and then the states in our region. So for income taxes, like I said, we have the benefit of donations made to 501c3s are tax deductible for income tax purposes. Donors often request documentation of tax exempt status for their income tax records. So if you make a single donation of $250 or more under the current IRS rules, you have to have documentation of that donation was made to a 501c3 organization. If you make a $60 donation, you don't need to have a receipt. You can say, hey, I made a $60 donation. But if you make a $500 donation, you need, like, if you're getting a donation that big in your chapter, you need to make sure that you're providing them with a donor acknowledgement letter and something that says, yeah, we're a 501c3, you gave us this amount of money on this state, and then they can give that to their accountant whenever they file their income taxes.
Does the region have one, like a preset one that chapters can use?
I have an example later on in the presentation, but I don't have like a template that I put out, but I was thinking about making one, but I have an example coming up. The non-cash donations also fall under these rules. If you're making a donation of stocks, bonds, assets, so if somebody donated computer equipment, a projector to a chapter, that you would still take the cash value of that. Something to be aware of, certain regulated assets like automobiles, boats, and planes require additional documentation. So if your chapter gets a car donated, you would need to have a 1098C form filled out for them. And I don't think this is an issue that's going to come up very often, but if it were to, that's something to be mindful of. Yeah.
What about services?
Because
I know we're a volunteer organization that we're volunteering.
What about driving? Like back and forth, back and forth?
so if you're driving, there would be they would be able to, so if like I was driving some students around to different service events in my personal vehicle, I can deduct the mileage using standard mileage rate, or you can also figure out how much you actually spent on gas, but your time is volunteer hours, so it's not really that. If you do, I'm not 100% sure about like pro bono work for like a lawyer or a CPA or something like that. I don't do income tax, so I'm not as familiar with those roles, but I would venture to say that likely there might be something with certain professional services, but generally that would be volunteer time. But again, like with your car, you can deduct your mileage. If you're driving to a conference, like you're getting benefit from being at this conference, right? It's a leadership development. So the conference expenses, you're benefiting from that. It's not a charitable giving. But if you're driving students around to service events, or hey, we're going to rent a van and drive to national convention, put as many students in it as fit in the van, then that the rental and any gas or anything associated with that would be charitable. So here's some examples of what donations, tax deductible donations are and are not. So cash gifts, non-cash gifts, we talked about. Things that are not tax deductible donations would be dues, purchases of products, any kind of conference and event registration fees. Raffle tickets and bingo entrance fees are not considered charitable donations. It's
Bingo.
Yeah, and then if you make a pledge to make a future donation, that's not considered a donation at the time that the pledge was made. It's a donation whenever the cash was received. And then here's an example of a donor acknowledgement letter. So if your chapter has a letterhead, I'd put that at the top. You could put, you know, your specific university. I would put the chapter name, like, you know, Alpha Iota chapter of Alpha Phi Omega, and then their address. And all it really needs to say is the person's name, the date. The date is very important. And then, you know, thank you for your donation of, here's what you donated. And we received that donation on this date. Those are critical pieces of information. And then, you know, Alpha Iota chapter is registered as a charitable organization under section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, and we operate under this FEIN. And then something that I've always included on the acknowledgement letters I've written are, please consult with your tax advisor regarding the proper handling of this gift on your income tax reporting. Thank you for supporting us. And then, you know, sign it, treasurer, president, whoever.
Every chapter has their own FEIN, even if they're not filling out that big.
Yeah, so the thing about chapters, there's a couple different like ways chapters can be organized. So Alpha Iota, for example, they have their own FEIN. They do their own tax reporting. It's completely separate from the national office. It's completely separate from their university. My home chapter at Carleton University, we were rolled under the university's FEIN. So we did that on purpose because we got funding from the university that we couldn't have gotten if we had been a separate FEIN. So all of our activity had to go through a campus bank account, and it had to go through, was reported on the university's FEIN. We didn't have to worry about any of that stuff, which was really awesome.
That's why I like all of this stuff too. Like, I don't like at Wittenberg, we were all in that, because we were in Catholic, so that's fine.
Yeah. And the process of like doing that, like when I was active at Carlo, we had a separate FEIN. And I think the semester after I pledged, I think we got all of that finally straightened out, because we had to have a letter from the university saying we're already reporting this activity under our 990 under this FEIN. Why should they file a separate one, right? Our regions and sections are considered part of the national office. So our region activity, our section activity would be reported on the national office's 990, and that's why we have to play by their rules, right? But they control our bank account.
So like if somebody made a donation to the section,
It would,
it goes to the national.
yeah, it would have to go through the national office. And there's like other rules on that, and I don't really want to get too deep into that. I want to focus on the chapters more. Yeah, this is an example of a donor acknowledgement letter. I can put a template together if that's something you think would be useful.
I've never heard a student talk about anything like this, so it's definitely
Okay.
Yeah, so that's just my concern, like, well, because I know you've gotten the donations, and I've never seen a letter go out, nor they ever asked me about it, so.
Yeah, and
if you have this letter, then you know how to ask for big donations.
Yeah.
Because students don't know how to ask for big donations.
yeah. And then something to also be mindful of is partial donations. So if you attend a fundraising dinner, generally speaking, those fundraising dinners, there's a cost of it that is the dinner, and then there's a portion of it that's a donation, right? So it might be a $30 dinner, but you're paying $100 for a ticket. If your chapter does any sort of events like that, you have to issue that donor acknowledgement letter, and I can put another template together for this that says, you know, thank you for attending our fundraising dinner. You know, your ticket cost was $100. The value of your dinner and the goods and services you received was $30. So you made a charitable donation to us of $70. You know, we're a 501c3 and all of the other things. And then that shows that, yeah, they spent $100, but only $70 of that was charitable. And it's up to the nonprofit to determine that. So, you know, be fair and honest with your donors. The next thing is sales and use taxes. So this is a completely different issue and something that like I've been talking to Bob London about actually on a national level, but sales and use taxes are imposed on sales transactions, and they're kind of the same thing. In Ohio, they're basically the same thing for the purposes of what we're doing. Sales typically is on the sale of whatever the product is, use is the tax for using it, and it's kind of the same thing. These taxes are not assessed at the federal level in the United States. They're imposed by state and local governments. In our region, they're only administered by the states. So Ohio has county sales taxes, but they're all reported through the state. So it's all state level, which is really nice. There are a couple of states in the US that don't have sales and use taxes. Alaska is kind of infamous because they don't have a state sales tax, but they have city sales taxes, and that gets really confusing. But these rules vary across the United States, and in most states, 501c3s are sales and use tax exempt. In our region, the states that are in our region, we're always exempt. In other states, we're not. So whenever you go to national convention or interact with other people, they might talk about sales tax sucks. Our rate in Washington is 10% sales tax, and we have to pay it on everything. And it's like, well, Washington requires 501c3s to pay those taxes. You're not exempt. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind when you interact with people outside of this region, is we're fortunate that we have access to those exemptions. Yeah.
So the convention is in Washington, and we bought supplies for students in Washington, we would have to pay this.
Yeah. So there's okay. So there's kind of two different things to think about on sales tax. You have your your revenues and your sales side, and then you have your purchases side. So on the revenue side, generally speaking, most of what we do in the states that Region H is in, we don't have to worry about collecting sales tax on the things that we're getting money from. So dues and conference fees in most states are exempt from sales tax. Donations are always exempt from sales and use tax, regardless of what state they're in. Partnership fundraisers, if you do something with a restaurant takeover, that restaurant's going to be responsible for handling all of the sales taxes on whatever is being purchased. And then typically what happens with those is they give a check to APO or whatever organization that APO is working with. So you don't have to worry about anything on that, because it's on APO side, it's just a donation. If you do a small chapter fundraiser like bake sales, there's special tax exemptions for church and nonprofit charitable fundraisers. So we don't have to worry about collecting sales tax generally. So if we're selling t-shirts, it kind of depends on how big it is, right? So I would say if a chapter is selling t-shirts, they're probably not going to have to worry about it. If you're selling through a merch vendor to do merch sales, which most of the time now that's what we do. We're not buying t-shirts and then selling them ourselves, right? It's their responsibility to worry about that. Kind of falls under the same rules as the restaurant takeovers. A good example of a nonprofit who would have to collect sales taxes would be at a museum. So at a museum, if they're doing, their regular charitable fund programming of, we're going to do educational programs with kids, and that's what we do for the most part. And like Vets Memorial is a good example of this. They have a whole bunch of educational programming that they do. Those educational programming things, that's the charitable purpose of the organization. They don't have to worry about sales tax on that side. But then they opened a gift shop. So that gift shop is a retail store. It's not part of the charitable purpose. It does fund the charitable purpose, but the people who are shopping in a gift shop, they're just making retail purchases. They're not doing any sort of charitable thing with that. So they do have to charge sales tax in the gift shop. But for our APO chapters, I would say generally, you don't really have to worry about collecting sales tax in the states that we're in. On purchases in the states that we're in, if you're a 501c3, everything you purchase as a 501c3 is exempt. So if you purchase food for an event, like technically you could take, you know, an exemption certificate to Kroger and not have to pay sales tax on it. And you should be doing that as a chapter. I would greatly encourage you to do that. The chapters that roll under their universities, their exemption certificates should be from the university. I know that sometimes that's hard. If it's a large event, like a conference, some kind of formal, something big, where there's contracts involved and it's not, I'm going into the store to grab something really quick, that's where it's like worth it to deal with those kind of university things you have to go through to get those exemption certificates. But I kind of don't think it's worth it if you're just running down to the store for some pencils or something.
If the university makes it hard to get.
Yeah.
Because like,
Yeah.
I think like at AGX, we're sponsored by Campus Ministry, and Campus Ministry like gave us a document, I don't know how long ago. And it's not going to change, like the tax certificate is not going to change. So even if the student involvement office like is now restricting it, like we have it on file, they can't take it back.
Yeah.
See, the cool thing is like a lot of places, the waivers purchasing cards have
They're
the number
attached.
on it. So by the time you, like the hardware is actually getting a hold of the card, but then you've actually got the tax exempt status on it.
Yeah. In our region, Indiana is a little bit different. I know all of you are from Ohio. Indiana's exemption certificates have to be, it's a little bit harder to get them. Just in general, Ohio, like from Ohio, you don't even need to fill out the state form. Like, here's my tax ID number, we're a 501c3, look us up and you get the exemption. Indiana doesn't work that way. So just something to kind of keep in mind if you're talking to students from other states. Kentucky also requires the state certificate, but it's a little bit different too. So getting exemption certificates, like, and I have this slide together. In Ohio, you can put together on the Ohio Department of Tax website, they have exemption certificate forms that are optional. Generally, I would encourage students to use it because you know that you're getting all the information that's needed. There's two forms for Ohio that I would use. The blanket exemption certificate, if you list the 501c, we're a 501c3 organization, everything we purchase is exempt, and you give it to a vendor that you use a lot. Like if you're always going to this one company for catering, give it to them and say, our chapter is always exempt. And what that vendor is obligated to do is put the chapter in their system as a tax exempt customer. And then you don't have to worry about doing the exemption certificate for every transaction. It's just a blanket, we're always exempt. If you have like a one-time sale that's happening, and we're probably never going to work with this vendor again, or if we do, it's going to be a while from now, or we don't know. You can give them a unit exemption certificate, that's what it's called, and that's a one-time sale exemption certificate. So those two things are different. The reasoning I would put is the same. We're a 501c3, we're purchasing things, for charitable purposes. In Kentucky, there's a specific exemption certificate form. It's called 51A126. And that needs to be filled out. In Indiana, you have to register as a nonprofit with the State Department of Revenue to get an exemption certificate. And then that form, it's called an ST105, you can provide to your vendors. I do have these notes of SST and MTC. So those are multi-state forms. I don't really think that chapters are going to run into this. But if you're on the state line and you're going into, like, if you're in Ohio, but you're on the Indiana state line, and sometimes you go to work with vendors in Indiana, and maybe it makes sense for you to have an event at a center in Indiana, it might make sense to be registered in Indiana and have a certificate there. What you can do,
So in the 4 times, chapters would do breakout trips. So they would sponsor chapter travels. So like, for instance, they'd go stay on Standing Rock for a week in South Dakota, and they'd have to pay for gas and they'd have to pay for groceries while they were there. So would that be one where you just get the multi-state one?
So if you're traveling out of
Like
state,
every year?
like it would, so there are different kind of things that come into play, and it depends on what state you're going into and what those states' rules are. There are transient forms for like a one-time sort of thing. There are some states like Ohio that you don't have to be registered in Ohio. So if a chapter from outside of Ohio was coming to Ohio, they would just need that FEIN number and, hey, we're a 501c3. It depends where you're at, right? And if you travel somewhere like California, you're probably not going to get the exempt. Like California assesses sales and use taxes on state and local governments. The multi-state certificate really is just for where you're registered. There are some states like Ohio where your FEIN is your registration number. It's what determines that you're a 501c3 and you get that exemption. So this is something like I threw in here. I don't think that it's really gonna affect most things on a chapter level, but those 2 forms are multi-state forms. So MTC is the Multi-State Tax Commission, and it's a group of states that have come together and they like talk about, we're gonna work together to kind of standardize some of our roles, and you can get pull a blank exemption certificate form from the MTC's website. And it's a list of every state that's a member, and then you can put your tax ID number in that state. So some states like Ohio, it would just be the FEIN because we're a nonprofit and we're registered as a nonprofit and we get the exemption through our FEIN. Some states like Indiana, it would be your taxpayer ID in the state of Indiana. So something to pay attention to. Every state has different rules. SST is streamlined sales tax, which is very similar to MTC, except streamlined sales tax has some other things that you can do. So I would encourage students to work with a tax professional who does indirect tax and multi-state taxes before doing anything with SST, because it can create a lot of nightmares if you don't know what you're doing. But SST allows you to register if you're doing like, okay, we're doing business in these 5 states and they're all members of SST. You can register through SST and file all of your sales tax returns through SST and all of your registrations and all of the tax administration you have to do through SST. It's really awesome for some people. People like me generally don't like SST, but it exists and it's out there. And sometimes having a multi-state exemption form is really useful, especially if you're right on the state line and we're just going to have one exemption certificate that has both our Ohio and Indiana numbers on it, right? There are, like I said, some exceptions to, places where 501c3s are not sales and use tax exempt. So in California, there's no exemption. Washington has limited exemptions. I think that there is a fraternal organization exemption for their B&O taxes. But I don't know. I haven't looked into it enough to know whether or not our chapters would qualify for that. So B&O is business and occupations tax, and it doesn't exist in Ohio. And that's probably why you've never heard of it. Georgia has restrictions on what types of 501c3 organizations are exempt from sales and use tax. North Carolina has a process where 501c3s have to pay the tax at the time of sale, but then they can request a refund through the city. And that's something that the firm that I work at does a lot of, requesting those refunds, but that's why you have to keep receipts. It's like a very important part of it.
They should be keeping receipts regardless.
Well, for a lot of different reasons.
So many reasons.
But that's, a piece of it. But I threw this in here because this doesn't really affect a lot of us because we're in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, but just to make you aware of different states have different rules. And if you're doing stuff with chapters in other states, if you're traveling for trips, something to be aware of, like your Ohio certificate doesn't do anything for you when you're not in Ohio. So, yeah. And then some tax reporting things. So we talked about this a little bit already. APO chapters are either directly registered with the IRS and have their own FEIN, or they're rolled under their campus FEIN. if they're rolled under the campus's FEIN, they generally don't have to worry about any of the tax registrations. They don't have to worry about any of that stuff typically. They're, 990, any business licenses that are needed for nonprofits in that city, like all of that stuff handled by the university. If the chapter has its own FEIN, then they're responsible for filing federal, state, and local tax reports, NFP registrations, any business licenses that are needed. And there are states that do require NFPs to have business licenses. I know a lot of West Virginia cities do, and a lot of those cities have the fee waived for 501c3s, but you still have to do the registration for them. The state and local reporting varies a lot through each state. So in Ohio, there's a charitable organization registration through the Ohio Attorney General's office. Some states are going to require that same kind of thing be filed through the Secretary of State. Some states it's going to be the Department of Tax. So you can't just look for the tax department, right? And I'm not really going to go into county and municipal registrations any more than I have, but that does exist and is out there.
So do we know, do we have a list of which chapters have their own FEIN and which ones are under the university?
I don't know. I don't know if the national office has that.
Because I thought the IRS 990 form had to do with them having their own FEIN, but it doesn't, does it?
Well, it does. Yeah.
Okay.
So
'Cause I think it was using that one that does it, but yeah, I don't know if all of my chapters are under the university now.
yeah, well, that's a good question to ask them if you don't know. I don't know if the national office has a list of that, if they keep tabs on that. That's kind of part of, there's
Portal, but like I have 3,000 on one list.
Because those are probably the ones that are really university.
Yeah, I have at least 3 that are myself. Say Wittenberg and there's another. But I remember. All the others are not there. And I know UD had to fill out another form this year, so I'm assuming they have.
We have had our own.
That's what I was
program,
assuming.
So that should be, yeah, sorry.
you're fine. Yeah,
The kids.
Have I ever mentioned that I have opinions on accessibility of systems?
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
Know a lot of accessibility questions too.
that might be something we might want to look at from like a section region kind of level of making sure the chapters are compliant, because our national bylaws do say we follow state and local rules and laws and federal laws. So all of this is part of that. Like these tax forms are not optional. You're either file the form or you're breaking the law. Like,
well, and like my chapter of capital, what we talked about yesterday is 3 people, and I can guarantee my brand new pledges.
I have no idea.
This chapter have no idea.
Yeah.
So,
right.
like,
Yeah.
I have no idea. So then I'm like, oh, I should probably figure out for them because they're not gonna fill it out if I don't tell them.
Yeah. And I'm always available to help with any of this
There
stuff.
could be like a treasurer's call for the region. Like if
I'm
you're a
down for
chapter
that.
treasurer, then at the beginning of each semester and a month before tax deadline, you have a treasurer's call.
Yeah,
That would
I'm
be-
totally down to do something like that.
Thank you. I'm too tactile. Where's my tactile? So I didn't bring it. I would have said, I brought it in. Okay, I'm good. I'm good.
So the 990 reporting is the next thing. Sorry, it's all right. It's early in the morning on a Sunday. There's the 990 reporting. There's several different versions of this form, just like there's several different versions of the 1040 that we all file for income taxes. So the 990 EZ form is probably what most chapters who have their own FEIN are filing. And it's often referred to as the postcard or the 990 postcard. That is a super easy form to fill out. Like check a box, so we have under 50K of gross receipts and you're good to go. That $50,000 annual gross receipts threshold is for a 3-year average. So this is something Alpha IOTA has kind of been super aware of because they hit over 50K one year and then under 50K one year. And they're like, if they hit over 50K this year, they're probably going to have to file the full form. If you're over the 50K threshold, you have to file the big form, and it's a lot more difficult and probably requires somebody with a tax background to fill it out. I don't think a college student should be trying to fill that out unless they're a grad student and they have an accounting background. The thing to be aware of, if you're close to that 50K gross receipts threshold, a chapter budget spreadsheet that most of the chapters have probably isn't going to cut it. So Alpha Iota 2 years ago, I worked with them with setting up QuickBooks. There's a whole bunch of other programs like QuickBooks. QuickBooks Online is super easy to understand. It's super accessible to non-accounting finance tax people. And the college students I worked with at Alpha Iota picked it up really quickly. This is the third treasurer I've been working with there. And they occasionally have questions, but they've got it figured out and under control. So if they're just using Google Sheets, or we have this spreadsheet that we use, or here's a notebook where all of our purchases and stuff comes from, that's not going to be good enough to help figure out the long form of 990. Whereas with QuickBooks, like when Alpha Iota hits the 50K threshold, because we're at a point where it's not if, it's when, we can pull some reports out of QuickBooks and we'll be able to fill out the form pretty easily.
So this form, because like Officer Portal creates something like this that they have to fill out, but that's not the real IRS form, is it? Or is that the form?
I'm not, it's been a long time. I was chapter president the last time I was an Officer Portal, so I don't know. Yeah.
For QuickBooks, like what's the kind of ballpark cost for an average chapter to do QuickBooks?
So I think Alpha Iota subscription is like $50 to $70 a month. I think Alpha Iota is $50 a month.
Right, but that's like.
Yeah. And the other, and our for the region, I think is $70 a month. The other piece of that is QuickBooks also has something called QuickBooks Payments, and I'm not sure of the pricing on that in PayPal because I didn't look too deep into that, but Alpha Iota was using PayPal to collect dues and t-shirt order payments and whatever other things they had to collect money for. And it was a nightmare trying to reconcile everything and figure out who had paid dues and who hadn't, and when people made partial. Yeah, so QuickBooks does link to PayPal, but it's not very friendly. And that's just because of how the link is between the two softwares. We looked into QuickBooks Payments, found out that QuickBooks Payments is going to charge them less per transaction than PayPal is. So they already have QuickBooks Payments. So our QuickBooks Online. So they adopted QuickBooks Payments, like, I don't know, 4 months after adopting QuickBooks. And so now everything is like, they put in, here's our members and we need to send invoices for pledge dues to these people and regular member dues to these people, t-shirt orders, whatever it is. And through QuickBooks, they can send an email to the brothers that's, here's your invoice for this thing. And the brother can go in through their email and pay with ACH or their checking account, their credit card, whatever, and make the payment straight through there. And then QuickBooks note says, okay, Sarah Smith paid her dues for pledging or whatever. And it kind of automates the process. And for a chapter as big as OSU, it's super helpful.
So I was just like wondering, can you do multiple chapters on one account?
I would recommend not doing that. I think that that's going to create a nightmare when it comes, like, you could,
Right.
and there's a lot of ways that you can categorize transactions. So like for region H, we have classifications for, here's our region H spending, but then each section has their own classification. Right. We're making a lot fewer transactions than a chapter would be, because a chapter has dues and all of those other things, whereas we get our dues in one lump sum, right? I just think it would be an absolute nightmare to try to do multiple chapters.
I'm just thinking about, like, a section that mainly has predominantly small chapters. Yeah, the section could, and then they could split that cost. Yeah, because for a lot of chapters, especially the small chapters, $50 to $70 a month is not feasible. Yeah, and I don't think that it would make sense for those small chapters to do that. Like a spreadsheet would probably be fine for a lot of those chapters. This is more so like, if you're gonna have to do the full 990 form, you need something like QuickBooks. Okay. If you're at, our gross revenue is
$2,000 a year, like my home chapter was,
Okay,
like, there's no point. There's no point in investing that time and money into that.
okay, that makes.
Yeah. It's not. It is literally just that, did you do it? Like it tells.
Yeah. Yeah. So something really important when you talk about 990s, the definition of gross receipts is not just like, here's what we got from our dues and fundraising. If you do any kind of event, any kind of transaction that happens where the chapter collects money is gross receipts. So here's kind of the situation. If you do a bake sale and you have, here's our like cash register for the bake sale, and you take all of that money, and then before you deposit the cash, you go and make some expenses or purchases, right? So we're going to purchase some things we need for this service event we're doing this weekend. Let's just go use this cash for that. You have to record the total amount that you got from the fundraiser, and then also record the expense, because you don't want to net it out. If you just record what was deposited in the bank, you're missing that other piece. And that is something that, you're probably not going to get caught if you're like doing that and like not in trouble or anything, but like, that is like, breaking the rules essentially. And for a chapter like FEIN, that can be the make or break a difference between where they're at. You want to document everything that is collected. If you do a restaurant takeover and the check goes to FEIN chapter, then that's gross receipts for FEIN, even though FEIN turned around and wrote a check to Make-A-Wish Foundation. If you do a restaurant takeover and Alpha Phi Omega is like advertising it or whatever, but then Chipotle writes their check to Make-A-Wish Foundation, that's not gross receipts for APO. So even though like the money ended up in the same place, it depends like who, right. And I kind of went through these scenarios already. In Region H, I put together like, here's tax reporting that you have to do. In Indiana, you need to be registered with the Department of Revenue. And here's like the forms you have to fill out. There's an annual nonprofit report that has to be filed through the Department of Revenue. And you don't qualify for the tax exempt purchases unless you registered and are current with your filings on that. In Kentucky and Ohio, it's registration with the Attorney General's office. And in Ohio, there's a annual charitable registration you have to file through the Ohio AG office. In Kentucky, you just have to send the AG office a copy of your 990.
And again, the school would be doing that
Yeah. Yeah. And I wouldn't worry about like, did your university file your 990? Like, that's not our problem, honestly. And I would be really shocked if a university wasn't handling that.
Right. They take intuition.
Right. So and then yeah, so regions and sections, like I talked about, are operating as divisions of the APO national office. So we don't file any separate tax reports. The responsibility is on the national office. Any donations we received are received by the national offices, FEIN, and they're charitable based on that. We're eligible for sales and use exemptions on anywhere where the national office is registered. So if you're somewhere where the national office isn't registered, like if you take a trip to a state where we don't have any chapters, then like you don't get an exemption. I don't know for sure. I don't know. But we do have chapters in Alaska. Thing about Alaska is Alaska doesn't have a state level sales tax. It's city level. So if you're in a city in Alaska where the national office isn't registered.
No, we've got chapters.
Yeah, so.
We'll bring it. Because we're gonna take a chapter trip to Hawaii or Alaska.
Those are just things to keep in mind.
I mean, yeah, that'd be fun, but no students would go.
But yeah, I know that we've kind of back and forth with questions, but That's all I had. I know we're probably at time, or over time, yeah. But if you have any questions ever, email me. I like this stuff with Capital. I'd be happy to help. I'm local, so I'd be happy to help out with anything, anywhere. Even if you're talking to a section chair in a different state and they're like, we can't figure this out, I'll help with that too. Like and at my job, like I read city ordinances most days all day, so I can figure that stuff out pretty easily.
This is really helpful.
I appreciate
This
that.
is the best tax information that I've gotten in a fraternity context.
Yeah,
period.
okay. I'm going to end the recording now.
Cool.